Welcome. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, wherever you are. If you'd like, you can leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Tonight's story takes us back to medieval England during a long and quiet struggle for the English crown known as the Wars of the Roses. There's no rush here. We'll move slowly, letting the history unfold at an easy, unhurried pace. To understand the Wars of the Roses, it helps to begin long before the first battle was ever fought, in an England that felt steady, familiar, and deeply rooted in routine. In the early 15th century, most people living in England would not have described their world as unstable or fragile. Life moved slowly, measured not by years or reigns, but by seasons, harvests, church festivals, and the steady rhythm of work repeated day after day. Villages changed little from one generation to the next. Fields were ploughed the same way they had been for centuries. Roads followed ancient paths worn down by countless feet, and homes were often built on the same foundations as those of parents and grandparents before them. The idea that England might be drawn into decades of internal conflict would have felt distant, even unlikely, to most people living their quiet lives in the countryside. The majority of England's population lived in small rural communities. These villages were made up of a handful of families, sometimes only a few dozen people in total, all connected through work, marriage, and shared history. Life revolved around agriculture. Fields of wheat, barley, and oats stretched across the landscape, broken up by hedgerows and narrow dirt paths. The days began early, often at first light, and ended when darkness made further work impossible. In this world, news travelled slowly. A change in kingship might be announced weeks or even months after it happened, carried by travellers, merchants, or clergy moving between towns. Even then, the impact felt indirect. Taxes might shift slightly, a new name would be spoken during prayers at church, but daily routines often continued uninterrupted. Above village life sat the structure of medieval society, layered carefully and rigidly. At the top stood the king, distant and largely unseen by most of his subjects. Below him were the great nobles, men and women who owned vast estates and commanded loyalty from hundreds or thousands of tenants. Beneath them were lesser lords and knights, then free farmers, and finally the largest group, peasants who worked the land they did not own. This hierarchy was widely accepted. It was taught through religion, reinforced by tradition, and rarely questioned openly. Order, more than ambition, was valued by most people. Stability mattered. Knowing one's place in the world brought a sense of comfort, even if life was difficult. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence. Churches stood at the centre of towns and villages, both physically and socially. The calendar itself was organised around religious observances. Saints' days marked time as much as months did. Bells rang to call people to prayer, to announce deaths, and to mark important events. In a world without clocks, for most people, sound carried meaning and structure. The church also reinforced the idea that kings ruled by divine approval. A crowned monarch was not simply a political leader, but a figure believed to be chosen, or at least permitted, by God. This belief gave kingship a sacred quality, and challenging it was no small matter. England, at this time, was still shaped by the memory of earlier conflicts. The long wars fought in France during previous generations had drained resources and taken lives, but they had also created a sense of English identity. Soldiers had come home, fields had been replanted, and towns rebuilt. By the early 15th century, there was a quiet desire for rest, for consolidation, for normalcy. The scars of war faded slowly, replaced by the routines of peace. Markets reopened. Trade resumed. Wool, one of England's most valuable exports, continued to move steadily through ports and across borders. For many, the nation felt settled, even if not prosperous for all. At the royal court, however, life moved differently. While villagers followed seasons, the court followed lineage, favour, and influence. The king's household was a world of ceremony, expectation, and subtle competition. Nobles gathered not only to advise, but to be seen. Marriage alliances were negotiated carefully. Titles, lands, and positions were granted or withheld in ways that could shape fortunes for generations. Power, here, was quiet and often patient. Decisions were rarely sudden. They unfolded through conversations, petitions, and long stretches of waiting. It is important to understand that the Wars of the Roses did not erupt suddenly into this world. There was no single moment when England shifted from peace to chaos. Instead, tension accumulated gradually, almost invisibly at first. Small disagreements over land, conflicting interpretations of inheritance, rivalries that simmered quietly rather than boiling over. These things existed alongside normal life for years, even decades, without immediately disturbing the broader population. The countryside remained calm. Towns continued their trade. Most people went to sleep each night, unaware that anything fundamental was changing. Kings, too, were human, shaped by circumstance and personality. A strong king could maintain balance among powerful nobles, rewarding loyalty and discouraging unrest. A weaker king, however, might unintentionally allow rivalries to grow. But even weakness did not always produce immediate consequences. England had systems in place, councils, courts, traditions, that could carry on governance even when leadership faltered. This resilience contributed to the illusion of stability. What made this period unique was not constant fighting, but the length of time over which tensions were allowed to grow. Claims to the throne were remembered carefully, passed down through family stories and legal arguments. Nobles kept track of their ancestry with great precision, preserving documents and traditions that traced their bloodlines back through generations. These records mattered deeply because in a world without elections or constitutions, legitimacy came from descent. A claim did not expire simply because time passed. It waited, quietly, until circumstances made it relevant. As England moved through the early 15th century, it did so without urgency. Fields were planted, children were born, old people passed away, kings came and went, often with little disruption to daily life. Yet, beneath this calm surface, the structure of royal succession was becoming increasingly complicated. Multiple families carried royal blood. Multiple interpretations of rightful inheritance existed side by side. None of this felt dangerous yet. It simply felt unresolved. This is the England in which the Wars of the Roses were born, not a land constantly at war, but a country accustomed to order, routine, and patience. The conflict that followed would not shatter this world overnight. Instead, it would move through it slowly, intersecting with ordinary life in uneven ways. Sometimes loudly, often quietly, and always shaped by the deep traditions that had defined England for centuries. And as we continue, we'll see how these traditions, so steady, so familiar, would eventually become the very framework through which the struggle for the crown unfolded. In medieval England, the idea of legitimacy rested not on popularity or policy, but on blood, memory, and carefully preserved lines of descent. And to understand why the Wars of the Roses unfolded the way they did, it's necessary to linger for a while on how people in the 15th century understood inheritance and authority, because these concepts shaped every decision made by kings and nobles alike, and they did so quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of daily life. Legitimacy was not something that had to be argued every day. It was assumed, reinforced by tradition, religion, and repetition. And when it was questioned, it was rarely done loudly at first, but rather through private conversations, legal petitions, and long-held grievances that waited patiently for the right moment to surface. And in this world, ancestry mattered deeply, far more than personal ability or character, because a ruler's right to govern was believed to come from lineage that stretched back through generations, connecting the present moment to a distant, almost mythic past. Families carefully recorded births, marriages, and deaths, maintaining family trees that were memorized, written down, and recited when needed. And these records were not simply historical curiosities, they were tools of power, capable of determining who might one day wear a crown or command loyalty from others. And among the English nobility, nearly everyone of consequence could trace some connection, however distant, to the royal family, creating a landscape in which claims overlapped and intertwined rather than standing apart clearly. And this complexity did not immediately cause conflict because medieval society was accustomed to ambiguity, to unresolved questions existing alongside one another without urgent need for resolution, especially when a reigning king sat securely on the throne. The ruling dynasty during this period was the House of Plantagenet, a family that had governed England for centuries, and over time its branches spread outward through marriages and offspring, creating multiple lines of descent that were all technically royal, though not equally powerful. And as long as succession passed cleanly from father to son, these branches remained dormant, respected but inactive, waiting in the background of history. But succession did not always move cleanly, and when it faltered, these dormant claims gained renewed importance. Medieval inheritance followed principles that were widely accepted but not always perfectly clear. With primogeniture, the practice of the eldest son inheriting titles and lands, serving as a general rule rather than an absolute law. And when sons died young, or kings had no direct male heirs, the question of who should inherit became more complex, opening the door to interpretation and debate, and these debates were not settled by popular vote or swift decree, but by councils, legal arguments, and appeals to precedent, often stretching back decades or even centuries, and because written law was limited, memory and tradition carried great weight, allowing different parties to emphasize different aspects of the past to support their claims. Legitimacy was also deeply tied to religion, with kings believed to rule by divine approval, and coronation ceremonies reinforced this idea through sacred rituals that presented the monarch as chosen by God. And this belief meant that challenging a reigning king was not merely a political act, but a moral and spiritual one, something that required careful justification rather than open defiance. And so even those who believed they had a stronger claim to the throne often waited, sometimes for years, before acting, watching for moments when the king appeared weak, ill, or unable to govern effectively, because those moments could be interpreted as signs that divine favour had shifted. Within noble families, children grew up hearing stories of their ancestors, of marriages that linked them to royalty, of rights that had been denied or overlooked, and these stories were passed down patiently, not as calls to immediate action, but as reminders of status and possibility, shaping how individuals understood their place in the world and what they might one day be entitled to claim. And this quiet inheritance of ambition was one of the defining features of the period because it meant that when conflict finally emerged, it did not come from nowhere, but from ideas that had been carefully preserved and internalized over generations. The English crown itself was not just a symbol of authority, but a source of land, wealth, and patronage, and control of the monarchy allowed a king to reward supporters, punish rivals, and shape the future of the realm, which meant that legitimacy had very real material consequences, influencing who held estates, who commanded armies, and who sat on councils, and for nobles whose power depended on royal favour, the identity of the king mattered deeply, even if ordinary villagers felt little difference in their daily routines. What made the Wars of the Roses particularly complex was that both sides could present claims that sounded reasonable within the logic of medieval inheritance, and neither side initially saw itself as rebelling against rightful authority, but rather as restoring it, and this sense of acting in defense of legitimacy rather than against it allowed conflict to escalate without the feeling of outright rebellion, making the wars feel, at least to those involved, like corrections to an imperfect system rather than a collapse of order. Throughout England, lawyers, clerks, and chroniclers worked quietly, copying genealogies and legal arguments, preserving documents that might one day be needed to justify a claim, and these texts circulated slowly, influencing how people understood the past and its relationship to the present. And while most villagers would never read these documents, their effects would eventually reach even the most remote communities through changes in leadership and allegiance. It is also important to remember that medieval people did not think of history as distant or abstract, but as something alive and present, with the actions of ancestors continuing to shape the world around them, and this belief gave weight to even the oldest claims, allowing events from long ago to feel immediately relevant, especially during moments of uncertainty. As the 15th century progressed, England carried within it a growing collection of unresolved questions about inheritance and authority. But these questions did not yet disrupt daily life, instead resting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for circumstances to align in a way that would bring them into the open. And in this sense, legitimacy was both a stabilizing force and a source of tension, maintaining order when succession was clear and gently undermining it when clarity faded. And as we move forward, we'll see how these carefully preserved bloodlines, once merely historical details, began to shape real decisions, real alliances, and eventually real conflict, all unfolding at a pace that felt slow and almost natural to those living through it. Edward III loomed large in the memory of medieval England, not as a distant or abstract figure, but as a king whose long reign had shaped the country in ways that were still felt generations later. And to understand how his legacy fed quietly into the Wars of the Roses, it's important to slow down and trace how his family expanded over time. Because the conflict that followed was not born from his actions directly, but from the many branches that grew outward from his lineage, each carrying a sense of royal connection that would later become deeply significant. Edward III had several sons, and during his lifetime this abundance of heirs was seen as a strength rather than a problem, a sign of stability and continuity that promised the crown would pass smoothly from one generation to the next. And for many years, that appeared to be exactly what happened, as the succession moved forward without major disruption, reinforcing the belief that the Plantagenet dynasty was secure. But beneath this surface calm, the presence of multiple royal sons created parallel lines of descent that would not disappear simply because one branch held the throne at a given moment. Edward's eldest son, known to history as the Black Prince, was expected to inherit the crown. And for a time, this path seemed certain. But his early death disrupted the natural order of succession, passing the crown instead to his young son, Richard II. And while Richard's reign would eventually come to an end, the more lasting consequence of this interruption was that it demonstrated how fragile even the most carefully planned succession could be, and how quickly expectations could shift when life unfolded differently than anticipated. Edward III's other sons went on to establish their own families, each connected unmistakably to the royal bloodline. And over time, these families accumulated lands, titles, and influence, becoming powerful in their own right. And while none of them immediately challenged the reigning king, their very existence meant that alternative claims to the throne remained alive, waiting quietly in the background of English politics. Medieval people understood inheritance as something that could skip generations, pass through female lines, or resurface through distant relatives, and this flexibility meant that no royal bloodline ever truly disappeared. It simply receded, becoming less visible until circumstances made it relevant again. The deposition of Richard II and the rise of Henry IV marked a turning point that brought Edward III's legacy back into focus, because Henry IV descended from one of Edward's younger sons, John of Gaunt, and while his claim was accepted at the time, it introduced the idea that kingship could be transferred laterally rather than strictly from father to son, setting a precedent that would echo for decades. And although this change did not immediately destabilize England, it altered how legitimacy was understood, making it possible for other branches of Edward III's family to imagine themselves as potential rulers. The Lancastrian kings who followed Henry IV worked to reinforce their authority through governance, ceremony, and tradition. But their connection to Edward III, while genuine, was not the only one that existed, and other descendants, particularly those associated with the House of York, quietly maintained their own genealogical claims, carefully preserving records that traced their descent back to Edward through different lines. And these records were not weapons at first, but safeguards, kept in case they were ever needed. Edward III's reign was remembered as a time of strength and expansion, and this memory lent weight to any claim that could be traced back to him, because invoking his name was a way of appealing to an idealized past, a period when the monarchy seemed firm and unquestioned, and as later kings struggled with illness, minority rule, or political division, this contrast became more pronounced, making Edward's legacy feel increasingly relevant. What makes this period especially suited to slow reflection is the way in which cause and effect unfolded across generations rather than years, with decisions made in one reign shaping possibilities long after those involved were gone. And for those living in the 15th century, these connections felt natural rather than contrived, because history was not something separate from the present, but a continuous thread woven through daily life. Nobles and lawyers studied family trees with care, tracing lines of descent back to Edward III, as if following a map that might one day guide them through political uncertainty. And these genealogies were discussed quietly, in halls and chambers, rarely spoken of openly, but always understood by those who mattered. The complexity of Edward III's legacy meant that when conflict eventually emerged, it did so within a framework that felt familiar and justified to those involved, because every major player could point to a legitimate connection to the past, and this shared ancestry blurred the line between rival and kin, making the Wars of the Roses as much a family dispute as a national one. For the broader population, however, Edward III's legacy remained largely symbolic, a name associated with stability and tradition, and it was only when later generations began to act on the possibilities he left behind that his influence became visible in everyday life. through changes in leadership, shifting loyalties, and the gradual emergence of conflict. As we move forward, we'll see how the branches that grew from Edward III's family tree, once seen as a source of strength, became the very pathways through which England's long struggle for the crown would slowly and quietly unfold. The House of Lancaster emerged from the long shadow of Edward III's reign, not as an abrupt break from tradition, but as one of its natural extensions, and to the people living through the early 15th century, Lancastrian rule initially felt familiar and continuous rather than revolutionary, because it was rooted in accepted ideas of lineage, inheritance, and royal authority, even as it subtly altered how succession worked in practice. The Lancastrian claim to the throne came through John of Gaunt, Edward III's third surviving son, a powerful noble whose wealth, influence, and longevity made him one of the most significant figures of his generation. And although John of Gaunt never became king himself, his position within the royal family placed his descendants close to the centre of power, allowing their claim to mature quietly over time, rather than erupt suddenly into conflict. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, would eventually become Henry IV, but this transition did not begin as a bold seizure of the crown, instead unfolding gradually through a combination of political dissatisfaction, shifting alliances, and the weakening authority of Richard II. And when Henry IV took the throne, many contemporaries saw the change less as an act of rebellion and more as a correction to a failing reign, a restoration of order rather than a disruption of it. This perception mattered deeply because it allowed the Lancastrian dynasty to establish itself without immediately destabilizing the kingdom. And for a time, England adjusted to its new rulers with relative calm as familia instituti. Ons continued to function and daily life carried on much as before. Henry IV's reign, however, carried within it an unspoken tension, because while his claim was legitimate within the flexible framework of medieval inheritance, it was not the most direct line descending from Edward III, and this subtle distinction would linger quietly in the background, rarely discussed openly, but never entirely forgotten, especially among those families who could trace their descent through alternative branches of the royal family. Henry IV worked steadily to reinforce his authority, relying on councils, law, and tradition to govern, and although his reign faced challenges, including rebellions and financial strain, the overall structure of kingship remained intact, allowing the Lancastrian line to feel secure, at least on the surface. His son, Henry V, strengthened this sense of stability through his competence and leadership, becoming a figure remembered for unity and purpose. And during his reign, questions of legitimacy faded further into the background, overshadowed by effective governance and a renewed sense of national confidence. Henry V's success, however, also created expectations that would prove difficult to meet, and when he died young, leaving behind an infant son, the Lancastrian dynasty entered a more fragile phase, one that revealed how much it depended on the personal strength of its ruler. Henry VI, who inherited the throne as a child, would grow into a king whose temperament and abilities differed greatly from his father's, and while this difference did not immediately lead to conflict, it slowly exposed the vulnerabilities of the Lancastrian position, particularly in a political culture that valued decisiveness and clarity. Throughout this period, the symbol later known as the Red Rose had not yet taken on the prominence it would acquire in later retellings of the wars, and contemporaries did not think of themselves primarily as Lancastrians in opposition to Yorkists, but rather as supporters of a particular king, a particular lord, or a particular interpretation of rightful rule. And this distinction is important because it reminds us that the conflict was not experienced as a simple binary struggle, but as a series of overlapping loyalties that shifted over time. The Lancastrian court continued to operate through familiar rhythms, with councils meeting, laws being issued, and patronage distributed, and for many years, these processes functioned well enough to maintain the appearance of stability, even as tensions grew quietly among the nobility, especially those who felt marginalized or overlooked. The House of Lancaster relied heavily on networks of loyalty built through land grants, marriages, and appointments, weaving together a broad coalition that supported the crown. But this network required constant maintenance, and any sign of weakness at the centre could cause individual strands to loosen, creating space for alternative claims to gain attention. What made the Lancastrian position particularly delicate was not its lack of legitimacy, but the existence of other legitimate claims that could be activated under the right circumstance, NCS. And as Henry VI's reign progressed, these circumstances slowly began to align, not through sudden catastrophe, but through a gradual accumulation of uncertainty, indecision, and competing interests. For the majority of England's population, Lancastrian rule still felt distant and abstract, a matter of names and symbols rather than lived experience. But among the nobility, the question of succession never fully disappeared, remaining a quiet undercurrent beneath courtly life, shaping conversations and calculations, even when outward appearances suggested calm. As we continue, we'll see how this delicate balance, maintained for decades by tradition and patience, began to shift as another branch of Edward III's family, the House of York, moved from the background toward the centre of England's political life. The House of York emerged gradually into prominence, not as an abrupt challenger to Lancastrian rule, but as a lineage that had long existed within England's political landscape, quietly aware of its royal descent and patiently preserving its sense of legitimacy. And for many years, Yorkist claims remained largely theoretical, discussed more in private than in public, because the structure of medieval politics rewarded restraint and timing rather than sudden action. The Yorkist claim to the throne traced back to Edward III through multiple lines, giving it a depth and complexity that strengthened its credibility in the eyes of those who understood genealogy. And this layered descent, passing through both male and female lines, allowed Yorkist supporters to argue that their claim was not weaker than the Lancastrian one, but in some interpretations more direct. And while such arguments were rarely shouted from rooftops, they circulated quietly among nobles, lawyers, and clerks who specialized in these matters. At the centre of the Yorkist identity stood the Dukes of York, powerful landowners with estates spread across England and Wales, whose wealth and influence placed them among the most significant figures in the realm, even before they openly asserted any claim to the crown. And this existing power base meant that the House of York did not need to manufacture authority. It already possessed it, woven into the fabric of English governance through land, loyalty, and long-standing service to the monarchy. Richard, Duke of York, became the most prominent representative of this house during the mid-15th century, and his rise was shaped not by open ambition at first, but by circumstance, particularly the growing weakness of Henry VI's government, which created a space in which York's authority and competence appeared increasingly necessary, and in this context, York's lineage became more than a historical detail, it became a potential solution to ongoing instability. The White Rose, later associated with the House of York, was not initially a dominant symbol in everyday political life, and like the Red Rose of Lancaster, it gained much of its prominence through later retellings and simplifications, but it nonetheless came to represent a sense of alternative legitimacy, a visual shorthand for a claim that rested on blood and precedent rather than rebellion. What distinguished the Yorkist position was its careful framing. Because York and his supporters rarely presented themselves as enemies of the crown, instead emphasizing their loyalty to England and their desire to protect the realm from mismanagement, and this approach allowed them to gain support among those who were dissatisfied with the current government, without forcing them to abandon the principle of rightful kingship. Yorkist arguments often focused on governance rather than conquest, pointing to financial strain, military failures, and factional disputes as evidence that change was needed, and in doing so, they appealed to a shared concern for order and stability that resonated with many nobles who had no desire for prolonged conflict. This slow, measured approach reflected the broader culture of medieval politics, in which patience was often more effective than force, and claims were allowed to mature over time rather than being pressed immediately. The House of York benefited from strong familial connections, including marriages that linked it to other influential families, strengthening its network of support and creating a web of relationships that extended across the kingdom. And these alliances were maintained through careful negotiation rather than dramatic gestures, reinforcing the impression that Yorkist influence was a natural extension of existing structures rather than a disruptive force. As tensions increased during Henry VI's reign, the Yorkist claim began to move from the margins toward the centre of political life, not because York declared himself king, but because his lineage and position made him an unavoidable figure in discussions about the future of the realm, and this shift was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, unfolding through appointments, councils, and temporary periods of authority granted during the king's incapacity. For ordinary people, the rise of the House of York remained largely invisible, experienced indirectly through changes in local leadership or the presence of different nobles at court, and life in towns and villages continued much as it always had, underscoring how distant high politics often felt from daily existence. Yet beneath this calm surface, the coexistence of two strong royal houses created a situation in which legitimacy itself became a contested space, not openly disputed, but subtly reframed, as each side interpreted the past in ways that supported its position, and this contest over meaning, rather than outright violence, defined the early stages of the Wars of the Roses. As the House of York moved closer to asserting its claim, it did so within a world that still valued continuity and tradition, and its challenge to Lancastrian rule was shaped by these values, making the coming conflict feel, to those involved, less like a break from the past and more like an argument over how that past should guide the future, setting the stage for the long, intermittent struggle that would follow. King Henry VI inherited the crown of England under circumstances that shaped his reign long before he was old enough to understand its weight, and from the very beginning, his kingship unfolded more as a condition to be managed than a role actively performed, creating an atmosphere of quiet uncertainty that settled over the court and lingered for decades. Crowned as an infant after the early death of his father, Henry V, Henry VI grew up surrounded by regents, guardians, and advisors who governed in his name. And while this arrangement preserved stability on the surface, it also meant that Henry never experienced a clear transition into authority, instead remaining dependent on others for guidance and decision-making well into adulthood. Unlike many medieval kings, Henry VI showed little interest in warfare, power struggles, or personal dominance, and contemporaries often described him as gentle, devout, and inward-looking, qualities that were admired in private life, but less effective in a political system that demanded firmness and clarity. And this contrast between expectation and temperament would quietly define his reign. Henry's deep religious devotion shaped his worldview, leading him to value peace, reconciliation, and moral conduct over ambition or force. And while these priorities were sincere, they placed him at odds with a nobility accustomed to strong leadership and decisive action, especially during times of financial strain and external pressure. Governance under Henry VI became increasingly fragmented, with authority distributed among councils and powerful nobles who acted with varying degrees of cooperation. And while these structures allowed the kingdom to function, they also created opportunities for rivalry and factionality, as individuals sought to expand their influence during moments when royal direction was absent or unclear. Henry's periods of mental illness further complicated this situation, because during these episodes, which could last months at a time, the king was unable to engage with his surroundings or participate in governance, leaving others to step in and fill the vacuum. And although medieval people did not understand mental health in modern terms, they recognized incapacity when they saw it, interpreting it through religious or symbolic frameworks that often intensified concern rather than easing it. During these times, the question of who should rule in the king's stead became increasingly urgent, and it was within this context that figures like Richard, Duke of York, gained prominence, not necessarily as challengers to Henry's legitimacy, but as practical solutions to an immediate problem. And this distinction mattered because it allowed alternative centres of authority to emerge without overtly challenging the sanctity of kingship. Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou added another layer of complexity to his reign, as Margaret proved to be far more politically active and assertive than her husband, taking on a visible role in defending the Lancastrian position and securing her son's future. And while her involvement helped compensate for Henry's weaknesses, it also intensified factional divisions at court, as nobles aligned themselves either with the Queen's circle or with rival power bases. Throughout Henry's reign, England did not descend into constant chaos, but rather experienced a prolonged period of uncertainty, marked by alternating phases of relative calm and rising tension. And for most people living outside the court, these shifts were felt only indirectly, through changes in taxation, local authority, or the presence of armed retainers attached to rival nobles. What made Henry VI's reign particularly significant was not a single dramatic failure, but the cumulative effect of long-term indecision, incapacity, and reliance on others, which gradually eroded confidence in the Crown's ability to maintain balance among competing interests. And as confidence weakened, the carefully preserved claims of other royal lineages began to feel less theoretical and more relevant. Yet, even as dissatisfaction grew among the nobility, there remained a widespread reluctance to challenge Henry directly, rooted in the belief that kingship itself was sacred and that disorder was worse than imperfect rule. And this reluctance delayed open conflict, allowing tensions to build slowly rather than erupt suddenly. Henry VI's reign thus became a kind of quiet turning point, a period in which the structures of medieval kingship were tested not by external invasion or dramatic rebellion, but by the subtler challenge of a ruler unsuited to the demands placed upon him. And as these pressures accumulated over time, they set the stage for a shift in power that would eventually draw England into the long, intermittent struggle remembered as the Wars of the Roses. As King Henry VI's ability to rule weakened, authority in England did not vanish, but instead flow, deed outward, settling gradually into the hands of nobles, councils, and regents who governed in his name, creating a political environment defined less by clear hierarchy and more by negotiation, patience, and quiet competition. And this redistribution of power did not feel revolutionary at first, because medieval governance had always relied on cooperation between the crown and the nobility. Yet during Henry's reign, this balance shifted subtly but persistently, allowing individual magnates to expand their influence while still professing loyalty to the king. Regency councils became central to the functioning of government, composed of senior nobles and churchmen who managed finances, law, and foreign policy. And while these bodies provided continuity, they also reflected the growing reality that no single figure was firmly in control, which in turn encouraged members to pursue their own interests within the framework of collective decision-making. Powerful families such as the Nevilles, the Percys, and others accumulated authority through land ownership, private armies of retainers, and long-standing regional influence, and these resources allowed them to act with a degree of independence that blurred the line between royal service and personal ambition, even as they outwardly maintained the language of duty and order. Noble households functioned almost like miniature courts, complete with their own officials, advisors, and armed followers, and loyalty to a lord often mattered more in daily life than loyalty to the distant king, especially in regions where royal presence as limited. And this localized power structure meant that national politics were shaped by regional concerns, alliances, and rivalries that developed slowly over time. The concept of bastard feudalism, in which nobles maintained loyalty through contracts, payments, and service, rather than traditional land tenure alone, further strengthened these networks, allowing magnates to extend their reach beyond their immediate estates and build broader coalitions. And while this system was not inherently destabilizing, it required strong central leadership to keep it in balance, something Henry VI's reign struggled to provide. During periods when Henry was incapacitated, the question of who should serve as protector of the realm became particularly significant, because the protector wielded real authority, and these appointments were never purely administrative, but deeply political, reflecting underlying struggles for influence among the nobility. Richard, Duke of York, emerged as a key figure in this context, appointed as protector during one of Henry's periods of illness. And while his role was framed as temporary and supportive, it allowed him to demonstrate competence and leadership, strengthening his position without openly challenging the king's legitimacy. The existence of multiple power centres at court created an atmosphere in which policy could shift depending on who held the king's favour at any given moment. And this unpredictability frustrated many nobles, who sought more stable arrangements, even if that meant aligning themselves with alternative claims to authority. Despite these tensions, there was a shared desire among the ruling elite to avoid outright civil war, and much effort was invested in negotiation, arbitration, and compromise, with councils convening repeatedly to settle disputes and restore order. And this preference for gradual resolution helps explain why the Wars of the Roses unfolded intermittently rather than as a continuous conflict. For the wider population, the rise of noble power was felt mainly through local interactions, as sheriffs, justices, and landowners enforced law and order in ways that reflected their patrons' interests. And while this could lead to uneven justice, it also preserved a sense of continuity that prevented daily life from being overwhelmed by national politics. What made this period increasingly fragile was the accumulation of unresolved grievances, as nobles who felt excluded from power or disadvantaged by court politics began to look beyond the existing system for solutions. And in this environment, claims to royal blood gained new relevance, offering a framework through which dissatisfaction could be expressed without abandoning the language of legitimacy. The power behind the crown thus became both a stabilizing force and a source of tension, maintaining governance in the absence of strong kingship, while simultaneously creating the conditions under which rival claims could be activated. And as these dynamics played out over years rather than months, they gradually reshaped the political landscape, setting the stage for the open conflicts that would eventually follow, not as a sudden rupture, but as the natural outcome of long-standing patterns of authority, loyalty, and restraint. The movement toward open conflict during the years leading up to the Wars of the Roses did not feel like a sharp descent or a sudden break from peace, but rather like a gradual drifting, almost imperceptible at first, as small pressures accumulated and began to press against the limits of a political system already strained by weak kingship and divided authority, and this slow slide was marked less by dramatic events than by a growing sense of uncertainty that settled over the nobility, shaping decisions in subtle ways long before armies ever gathered. Economic difficulties played a quiet but persistent role in this process, as the cost of governance, defence, and maintaining noble households increased while traditional sources of royal income struggled to keep pace, forcing the crown to rely more heavily on loans, grants, and the goodwill of powerful families. And this dependence altered relationships at court, making financial disputes inseparable from questions of influence and loyalty. At the same time, England's experiences in foreign affairs, particularly the fading of earlier successes abroad, contributed to dissatisfaction among those who associated strong kingship with military achievement. And while most people were far removed from these concerns, the nobility felt them acutely, interpreting setbacks as signs that the realm lacked firm direction. Personal rivalries among leading figures further complicated the situation, as long-standing disputes over land, titles, and regional dominance were carried into the national arena, where they intersected with broader questions about who should guide the kingdom. And these rivalries were rarely resolved quickly, instead passing from one generation to the next, layered with memory and resentment that made compromise increasingly difficult. What distinguished this period was the way in which disagreements that might once have been settled locally or privately began to align along broader factional lines. As nobles sought allies at court to strengthen their positions, gradually polarizing the political landscape without openly acknowledging that polarization was taking place. Efforts to restore harmony were frequent and sincere, with councils, parliaments, and formal reconciliations convened to address grievances, and while these measures often produced temporary calm, they did little to resolve underlying issues, which resurfaced in new forms as circumstances changed. The language used during this time remained measured and respectful, emphasizing loyalty to the king and concern for the common good, and even those who opposed one another framed their actions as necessary corrections rather than challenges to the established order, allowing conflict to develop within accepted norms rather than outside them. For many nobles, the question was not whether the Lancastrian dynasty was legitimate, but whether it was capable of providing effective leadership under existing conditions, and this distinction opened space for alternative claims to be considered without immediately labelling them as rebellion, making the idea of change feel permissible rather than dangerous. Richard, Duke of York, became a focal point for these tensions, not because he demanded the crown outright, but because his lineage, wealth, and administrative competence offered a credible alternative during moments of crisis. And as his influence grew, so too did resistance from those invested in maintaining the current balance of power, creating a dynamic in which each side's actions reinforced the other's suspicions. The presence of private armed retainers, a common feature of noble households, added another layer of unease, as displays of strength, even when intended as deterrents, contributed to an atmosphere of readiness that made violence more thinkable, though still not inevitable. And these forces were usually employed in controlled, limited ways rather than as instruments of widespread warfare. Among ordinary people, signs of impending conflict were often indirect, noticed through rumours, increased demands for service, or the passage of armed men through local areas. And while such occurrences could be unsettling, they were not yet disruptive enough to shatter the routines of daily life, reinforcing the sense that whatever troubles existed remained confined to the upper levels of society. What ultimately pushed England closer to open conflict was not a single decisive moment, but the gradual alignment of unresolved succession questions, weakened royal authority, economic strain, and personal rivalries into a pattern that made confrontation increasingly likely, even if few could have predicted exactly when or how it would occur. And as patience gave way to frustration, the political culture that had long favoured compromise began to accept the possibility that force might be necessary to restore clarity, setting the stage for the first battles of the Wars of the Roses, which would emerge not as an explosion of chaos, but as the next step in a long, carefully unfolding process. When the first battles of the Wars of the Roses finally took place, they did not arrive with the sense of total upheaval that later generations might imagine, but instead appeared as controlled, almost restrained encounters that grew out of years of mounting tension. And for those living at the time, these early clashes felt less like the beginning of a prolonged civil war and more like isolated confrontations meant to settle specific disputes, restore order, or demonstrate strength. Medieval warfare in England during the mid-15th century was shaped by tradition and limitation, with armies composed largely of retainers loyal to individual nobles rather than mass levies drawn from the general population. And as a result, the number of people directly involved in these early battles was relatively small compared to later conflicts, reinforcing the impression that the fighting was a matter for the ruling elite rather than the nation as a whole. The Battle of St Albans in 1455 is often identified as the first major engagement of the wars, and while it did involve violence and loss, its scale and duration were limited, lasting only a short time and taking place within a familiar town rather than on a vast battlefield, and this contained nature reflected the way conflict was still understood as something that could be resolved quickly through decisive action rather than sustained campaigns. The participants in these battles often knew one another personally, having served together at court or on councils in earlier years, and this familiarity influenced how fighting unfolded, with an emphasis on capturing or neutralizing key figures rather than inflicting widespread destruction. And this approach helped keep the conflict from immediately spiraling into something more destructive. Between battles, long stretches of relative calm returned, as negotiations resumed and attempts were made to reconcile opposing factions, and these pauses reinforced the belief that violence remained an option of last resort rather than a permanent condition, allowing daily life to continue largely uninterrupted for most of the population. Soldiers who took part in these early engagements were typically men who already lived with the possibility of service, trained and equipped through their lord's household, and their experience of war involved extended periods of waiting, marching, and preparation punctuated by brief moments of fighting, a rhythm that mirrored the broader pattern of the conflict itself. Towns and villages near battle sites might feel the impact more directly through the presence of armed men or the disruption of trade, but even here, the effects were often temporary, with markets reopening and routines resuming once the immediate danger passed, reinforcing the resilience of local communities. The political significance of these early battles lay not in their scale, but in their implications, because each engagement demonstrated that disputes over authority could now be settled by force as well as negotiation, subtly altering expectations about how future conflicts might unfold, and this shift in perception was perhaps more consequent than the battles themselves. Leaders on both sides continued to frame their actions in terms of loyalty to the king and the preservation of order, avoiding language that suggested rebellion or revolution, and this careful framing allowed supporters to justify their participation without feeling they were undermining the foundations of society. For many nobles, the decision to fight was shaped by practical considerations as much as ideology, including the need to protect estates, maintain honour, and secure positions within an uncertain political landscape, and these motivations contributed to a cautious approach that prioritized limited objectives over total victory. As news of these battles spread slowly across England, carried by travellers and messengers, it was absorbed into the existing fabric of life rather than overwhelming it, discussed in taverns and at markets with a mixture of concern and curiosity, but rarely with the sense that the world had fundamentally changed. Yet beneath this surface calm, the precedent had been set, and once blood had been shed in the name of competing claims, it became easier to imagine further violence, even as many hoped it could still be avoided. And in this way, the first battles of the Wars of the Roses marked not a dramatic turning point, but a subtle shift in direction, nudging England further along a path that would continue to unfold slowly and unevenly over the years to come. For the men who found themselves drawn into the early stages of the Wars of the Roses, life as a medieval soldier was defined far more by routine, waiting, and uncertainty than by constant fighting and understanding. This quieter reality helps soften the way we imagine the conflict, grounding it in the everyday experiences of individuals whose lives were only occasionally interrupted by battle. Most soldiers were not professionals in the modern sense, but retainers attached to noble households, men who lived and worked on their lord's lands in peacetime and answered a call to service when required, bringing with them equipment they often owned themselves or had been provided over time, and this meant that soldiering was woven into ordinary life rather than existing as a separate occupation. Training tended to be informal and gradual, learned through drills, hunting, and communal practice rather than standardized instruction, and skills such as handling weapons or maintaining armor developed slowly across years rather than being acquired suddenly in preparation for war. Equipment varied widely depending on wealth and status, with some men wearing sturdy padded clothing and simple helmets, while others possessed more complete armor. Yet even among better equipped soldiers, comfort was limited, and long marches, exposure to weather, and the weight of gear shaped their experience more than the brief moments of combat itself. Much of a soldier's time was spent waiting, sometimes for weeks or months, as leaders negotiated, gathered resources, or decided whether fighting was truly necessary. And during these periods, camps were places of conversation, maintenance, and routine, where men repaired clothing, cleaned equipment, ate simple meals, and passed time in familiar ways that echoed life at home. When armies moved, they did so slowly, following established roads and paths, stopping frequently to rest, forage, or wait for instructions. And this deliberate pace reflected both logistical limitations and the broader political caution of the period. As commanders sought to avoid unnecessary engagement, battles, when they occurred, were often brief and decisive rather than prolonged, and for many soldiers, the experience of fighting was intense but short-lived, followed by a rapid return to waiting, marching, or dispersal back to local communities, reinforcing the sense that war was an interruption rather than a permanent state. After engagements, survivors often returned home relatively quickly, resuming agricultural work or household duties with little ceremony, carrying memories rather than visible rewards. And this movement back and forth between civilian and military life blurred the distinction between the two, making conflict feel episodic rather than all-consuming. The emotional landscape of the medieval soldier was shaped by loyalty to a lord rather than abstract political causes, and decisions to fight were often driven by obligation, honour, and the desire to protect one's place within a familiar social structure, rather than by personal investment in dynastic claims. Fear and anticipation existed, but they were tempered by familiarity, as many soldiers had experienced previous conflicts, or at least grown up hearing stories of them, allowing them to situate their own service within a broader pattern of life that continued before and after war. This perspective helps explain why the early stages of the Wars of the Roses did not immediately overwhelm English society, because the individuals who fought were integrated into communities that absorbed their absence and return without dramatic disruption, maintaining continuity even as political struggles unfolded above them. And as the conflict progressed, this rhythm of waiting, brief action, and return would continue to define the experience of many soldiers, shaping a war that moved slowly, unevenly, and often quietly across the landscape of 15th century England. Edward, Duke of York, entered the unfolding conflict not as a sudden conqueror, but as a figure shaped by long preparation, family expectation, and the steady accumulation of experience. And his rise illustrates how leadership during the Wars of the Roses often emerged gradually rather than dramatically, built through presence, competence, and timing. Born into the powerful House of York, Edward grew up aware of his lineage and the responsibilities it implied, surrounded by discussions of ancestry, loyalty, and service that quietly framed his understanding of the world. And while these ideas did not immediately translate into ambition for the crown, they formed a background against which later decisions would make sense. Edward's early life was marked by exposure to noble administration and military obligation, learning how estates were managed, how retainers were organized, and how authority was exercised through relationships rather than commands alone. And this practical education helped prepare him for leadership in a political environment that valued stability and continuity. When conflict began to surface more openly, Edward distinguished himself through his physical presence and confidence, qualities that contrasted with the uncertainty surrounding Henry VI's rule. And while these traits alone did not guarantee loyalty, they made Edward a focal point for those seeking clearer direction. His role in early battles demonstrated not only personal courage, but an ability to inspire confidence among followers. And these experiences gradually elevated his status within the Yorkist cause, transforming him from a noble participant into a central leader whose actions carried broader significance. Importantly, Edward's rise was supported by a network of allies, including influential families such as the Nevilles, whose backing provided both military strength and political legitimacy, and this support was cultivated through careful negotiation rather than force, reinforcing the sense that Edward's leadership was grounded in cooperation as much as command. Throughout this period, Edward framed his actions in terms of loyalty to the realm and the need to restore effective governance, avoiding language that suggested personal ambition for kingship, and this restraint allowed him to attract support from those who were dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, but hesitant to endorse outright rebellion. As circumstances changed and the conflict deepened, Edward's claim to the throne became more openly discussed. Yet even then, it was presented as a logical extension of his lineage and service rather than a radical departure from tradition, and this framing resonated in a society that valued continuity with the past. For ordinary people, Edward's rise remained largely abstract, experienced indirectly through shifts in leadership and the presence of different banners or officials, while daily routines continued much as before, underscoring the distance between high politics and everyday life. Edward's emergence as a leading figure thus reflected the broader patterns of the Wars of the Roses, where power consolidated slowly, shaped by long-standing relationships and shared understandings of legitimacy. And, as his influence grew, it became increasingly clear that the balance of authority in England was changing, setting the stage for a new phase of the conflict in which the question of kingship would move from the background to the centre of political life. Edward's transition from leading noble to king unfolded through a series of developments that felt measured and almost inevitable rather than sudden, shaped by circumstance as much as intention. And when he finally assumed the crown as Edward IV, it was experienced by many not as a dramatic rupture, but as a shift in emphasis within an already familiar structure of rule. The decision to proclaim Edward king emerged from a growing belief among his supporters that the existing government could no longer provide stability, and this belief was reinforced by ongoing uncertainty surrounding Henry VI's capacity to govern, which made the question of leadership feel increasingly practical rather than ideological. Edward's claim was presented carefully, grounded in lineage, and framed as a restoration of effective kingship rather than an act of personal ambition, and this approach allowed those who supported him to reconcile their actions with long-held beliefs about loyalty and legitimacy. When Edward was crowned, the ceremony itself followed established traditions, reinforcing continuity and signalling that the institutions of monarchy remained intact even as the individual wearing the crown changed, and this sense of continuity helped prevent widespread disruption, as familiar rituals reassured both nobles and common people that the order of society persisted. For many across England, the immediate effects of Edward's accession were subtle, marked by changes in official titles, the issuing of new proclamations, and the presence of different representatives of royal authority, while daily routines in towns and villages continued largely unchanged, reflecting the resilience of local life. Edward's early reign focused on consolidating support, rewarding allies, and restoring financial and administrative stability, tasks that required patience and negotiation rather than force, and his ability to engage actively with these responsibilities contrasted with the passivity that had characterized much of Henry VI's rule, fostering a cautious optimism among those who valued decisive leadership. At court, Edward's presence brought a renewed sense of direction, as decisions were made more clearly and authority appeared more centralized. Yet this centralization did not eliminate factionalism, instead reshaping it, as former allies and rivals adjusted to the new balance of power. The king's youth and energy were often noted by contemporaries, contributing to an impression of renewal, though this impression was tempered by the understanding that England's underlying divisions had not disappeared, merely shifted in response to changing leadership. Edward's reign also highlighted the ongoing importance of personal relationships in medieval politics, as marriage alliances, patronage, and favour continued to shape the distribution of power And while his authority was greater than that of his predecessor, it remained dependent on the cooperation of the nobility for the broader population. Edward IV's kingship reinforced the sense that political change occurred at a measured pace, intersecting with ordinary life only occasionally. And while the crown now rested on a different head, the rhythms of work, worship, and community endured, underscoring how the Wars of the Roses progressed through incremental adjustments rather than sweeping transformations. And as Edward settled into his role as king, the conflict entered a new phase, defined not by uncertainty alone, but by the challenges of maintaining authority in a kingdom where alternative claims and shifting loyalties still quietly persisted. While the Wars of the Roses are often told through the actions of kings and soldiers, much of the period's direction was shaped quietly by women whose influence unfolded through marriage, family, counsel, and persistence rather than public command. And understanding their role helps soften the narrative, revealing a world in which power often moved indirectly and patiently, rather than through open confrontation. Medieval queens and noblewomen were expected to operate within defined social boundaries. Yet within those boundaries, they exercised significant authority, managing estates, arranging alliances, and acting as intermediaries between powerful men. And this form of influence, subtle and sustained, proved especially important during times of uncertainty when formal leadership faltered. Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI, stands out as one of the most visible figures of this period, not because she sought conflict for its own sake, but because she felt compelled to protect her husband's position and, later, her son's inheritance, and her involvement in politics emerged gradually, shaped by necessity rather than ambition, as she responded to the growing threat posed by rival claims. Margaret's efforts to build support for the Lancastrian cause relied heavily on negotiation, patronage, and the careful cultivation of loyalty, and while later accounts often portray her actions dramatically, at the time they were understood as part of her role as queen and mother, duties that required persistence and resolve rather than force. Alongside Margaret, other noblewomen played, equally important, if less visible, roles, maintaining the stability of estates during their husbands' absences, raising heirs who would inherit both land and allegiance, and serving as conduits for information within extended family networks that spanned regions and factions. Elizabeth Woodville, who would later become Edward IV's queen, illustrates another form of influence, one rooted in personal relationships and social mobility, and her marriage to Edward altered the balance of power at court by introducing new alliances and reshaping existing ones, demonstrating how private decisions could have wide political consequences. Marriages during this period were rarely simple unions of affection, instead functioning as strategic tools that linked families, secured claims, and redistributed influence. And noble women were central to this process, their bodies and dowries becoming bridges between competing interests, even as their personal experiences remained largely unrecorded. Beyond the royal court, women of lesser rank also contributed to the fabric of stability that allowed society to endure through prolonged conflict, managing households, overseeing agricultural work, and maintaining community ties that softened the disruptions caused by shifting allegiances and occasional fighting. The influence of these women was often expressed through continuity rather than change, as they preserved traditions, upheld obligations, and ensured that daily life carried on despite political uncertainty, and this quiet persistence provided a counterbalance to the instability at the top of society. It is important to note that women's power during the Wars of the Roses was not exercised in isolation, but in constant dialogue with male relatives and allies, reflecting the collaborative nature of medieval governance, where decisions were shaped by networks rather than individuals alone. Through letters, marriages, and personal appeals, queens and noblewomen helped sustain factions, mediate disputes, and occasionally intensify rivalries, all while operating within a social framework that emphasized discretion and endurance. As the conflict continued, their contributions remained largely unseen by those outside elite circles, yet they were essential to the long-term functioning of both Lancastrian and Yorkist causes, reinforcing the idea that the Wars of the Roses were not solely a series of battles, but a prolonged negotiation of power conducted as much in households and councils as on fields of combat. And as we move forward, this quieter form of influence will continue to shape the story, reminding us that history often advances through patience and presence as much as through force. By the middle years of the Wars of the Roses, England had begun to display a remarkable capacity for adaptation, not because the conflict was mild or insignificant, but because the rhythms of everyday life were resilient enough to absorb political change without collapsing, and this ability to adjust gradually became one of the defining features of the period, shaping how the wars were experienced by most people living through them. For villagers, townspeople, and even many landowners, shifts in royal authority were often felt as changes in names, seals, and allegiances, rather than as immediate disruptions to work or community. And while uncertainty lingered in the background, daily responsibilities continued to demand attention, pulling focus away from distant struggles for the crown. Markets still opened on familiar days, fields still needed tending, and churches still marked the passage of time through bells and services, reinforcing a sense of continuity that grounded people even as political banners changed. Local officials adapted quickly, offering loyalty to whichever authority appeared most secure at the moment, not out of cynicism, but out of necessity, because maintaining order mattered more than abstract questions of legitimacy. And this pragmatic approach allowed communities to remain functional despite the shifting landscape of power. Noble households mirrored this adaptability, adjusting their alliances carefully, sometimes cautiously, as circumstances evolved, and while these shifts could be unsettling, they were often framed as temporary accommodations rather than permanent betrayals, preserving relationships that might be needed again in the future. The intermittent nature of the conflict also contributed to this adaptability, as long periods of calm separated moments of fighting, allowing society to recover, reassess, and resume familiar patterns before the next phase of tension emerged. Memories of earlier upheavals, including past wars and plagues, had already taught people that instability could pass, encouraging piety once rather than panic. And this historical perspective softened reactions to current events, making them feel like part of a longer cycle rather than an unprecedented crisis. Even among those directly affected by fighting, such as towns near battle sites or estates caught between rival factions, recovery was often swift, driven by necessity and communal effort, as damaged buildings were repaired and routines restored as soon as possible. This culture of adaptation extended to the political sphere as well, where shifting loyalties were understood as responses to circumstance rather than moral failings, allowing former rivals to coexist and even cooperate when conditions changed. Over time, this flexibility became normalized, shaping expectations about governance and reinforcing the idea that stability did not require absolute certainty, but rather the ability to adjust thoughtfully to evolving realities. The country's quiet endurance during these years helps explain why the Wars of the Roses unfolded over decades rather than exploding into continuous chaos, because England's social fabric, woven from habit, obligation, and shared memory, absorbed shocks gradually, allowing life to move forward even as the struggle for the crown continued, and this endurance would remain a constant presence as the conflict entered its later, more complex phases. As the Wars of the Roses continued, loyalty in England became less a fixed commitment and more a careful, ongoing calculation, shaped by circumstance, survival, and the long memory of relationships rather than by sudden emotion. And T, his gradual shifting of alliances, was one of the defining characteristics of the conflict, giving it a fluid, almost quiet quality despite its underlying tension. Nobles found themselves navigating a landscape in which yesterday's ally might become tomorrow's rival, not necessarily through malice, but through changing conditions that made old arrangements untenable. And in this environment, flexibility was often seen as prudence rather than betrayal. Land ownership, marriage ties, and regional influence all played roles in these decisions. As families weighed their interests against the risks of commitment, seeking to preserve their position regardless of which royal house appeared ascendant at any given moment. The Earl of Warwick, later remembered as the Kingmaker, exemplifies this pattern, not because his actions were uniquely dramatic at the time, but because they reflected the logic of noble politics, in which loyalty was tied to mutual benefit and shared purpose, rather than to abstract ideals. Warwick's alliances shifted as his relationship with Edward IV evolved, influenced by disagreements over policy, patronage, and personal influence. And while later accounts emphasized the drama of these changes, contemporaries often understood them as responses to practical concerns within a volatile political environment. Shifting loyalties were facilitated by the existing structure of noble households, which maintained private forces and regional authority that could be redirected with relative ease, allowing nobles to realign themselves without immediately dismantling their power base. These changes were often accompanied by careful negotiation, reassurance, and attempts to preserve dignity, as public perception mattered deeply in a society where reputation influenced cooperation and support. For those lower down the social hierarchy, such shifts were experienced indirectly through changes in leadership or the arrival of new officials. And while these transitions could create uncertainty, they were usually managed in ways that minimized disruption to daily life. The language used to describe these realignments remained measured, emphasizing duty to the realm and concern for stability rather than personal ambition. And this rhetorical continuity helped maintain a sense of order even as political arrangements evolved. The repeated pattern of alliance and realignment contributed to the intermittent nature of the conflict, as moments of tension gave way to temporary settlements that postponed further fighting, reinforcing the impression that resolution was always just within reach. Over time, however, these shifts also eroded trust, as repeated changes made it harder to establish lasting agreements. And this erosion gradually increased the likelihood of renewed conflict, even among those who preferred peace. The Wars of the Roses thus became a prolonged negotiation of loyalty, conducted through careful choices rather than sudden reversals. And this slow movement of alliances, shaped by memory, obligation, and restraint, played a central role in sustaining the conflict across generations, without overwhelming the society that lived through it. As Wars of the Roses stretched onward, the experience of exile and return became an almost familiar pattern among England's ruling figures, reflecting the instability of power during this period and the way authority could shift without final resolution. And this rhythm of departure and restoration contributed to a political atmosphere in which permanence felt elusive and rule itself seemed conditional rather than absolute. For kings and nobles alike, losing power did not always mean the end of influence, but often marked a pause, a period of waiting beyond England's borders or within its quieter regions, where plans could be reshaped and alliances quietly renewed. Exile was rarely experienced as isolation, because those displaced from power typically retained networks of supporters, corresponded with allies, and remained closely attuned to developments at home, treating absence as a strategic interval rather than a defeat. The movement between exile and return reinforced the sense that legitimacy could survive interruption, that a claim to authority did not vanish simply because it was temporarily unfulfilled, and this belief sustained continued competition for the crown without forcing immediate, decisive confrontation. When rulers returned, they often did so through negotiation as much as force, capitalizing on shifts in loyalty, dissatisfaction with current leadership, or the simple passage of time, which softened resistance and allowed former opponents to accept change without humiliation. These cycles affected governance at every level, as officials adjusted repeatedly to new masters, issuing revised proclamations and reaffirming oaths in a manner that became almost routine. And this repetition normalized political change, making it feel manageable rather than catastrophic. For the wider population, the exile and return of rulers was experienced through subtle cues rather than dramatic upheaval, as symbols of authority were replaced and familiar names reappeared in public prayers or legal documents, while the fundamental structures of daily life remained intact. The uncertainty of rule during these years fostered a cautious political culture, in which long-term planning was tempered by the recognition that circumstances might shift again, encouraging nobles and officials to preserve flexibility and avoid irreversible commitments. This caution extended to military action as well, as leaders weighed the risks of decisive battles against the possibility that compromise or delay might yield better outcomes, reinforcing the intermittent nature of the conflict. Over time, the repeated pattern of exile and return contributed to a sense of fatigue among the ruling elite, who increasingly longed for stability even as they remained entangled in unresolved claims, and this fatigue subtly altered priorities, making peace and consolidation more attractive than continued contest. The uncertainty of rule thus became both a defining feature of the Wars of the Roses and a force that gradually pushed England toward resolution. As the costs of perpetual adjustment accumulated and the desire for lasting order grew stronger, shaping the final phases of the conflict that lay ahead. As the Wars of the Roses moved into their later phase, the conflict began to feel less like a series of urgent struggles and more like a lingering condition of English political life, shaped by habit, fatigue, and the gradual narrowing of possibilities. And this shift altered both how the wars were fought and how they were understood by those living through them. The number of major battles decreased, not because tensions had disappeared, but because repeated cycles of conflict and compromise had taught the ruling elite that decisive outcomes were difficult to achieve and often temporary, encouraging a more cautious approach that favoured consolidation over confrontation. Many of the original participants had aged or died, replaced by a younger generation who inherited not only titles and estates, but also unresolved grievances and alliances, and for them, the wars were not a dramatic break from the past, but a familiar inheritance, something that had always existed in the background of their political lives. This generational shift softened the emotional intensity of the conflict, as long-standing rivalries became normalized, discussed with resignation rather than outrage. And this normalization contributed to a quieter, more measured tone in political decision-making. Governance during this period continued to function through established institutions, even as leadership changed hands, reinforcing the sense that the state itself endured independently of individual rulers. And this endurance allowed society to absorb further transitions without descending into chaos. The ability, increasingly aware of the costs associated with prolonged instability, began to prioritize the protection of estates and families over the pursuit of absolute victory, and this pragmatism reduced the scale and frequency of military engagements, making negotiation and alliance building more prominent tools of influence. For ordinary people, the later phase of the wars often passed with limited direct impact, experienced through occasional disruptions rather than constant fear. And this distance between political struggle and daily life further dampened the sense of crisis, allowing routines to continue with relative calm. The language of politics also evolved during this time, with greater emphasis placed on reconciliation, lawful succession, and the restoration of peace, reflecting a collective desire to bring the long period of uncertainty to a close. Yet, despite these changes, the underlying question of legitimacy remained unresolved, sustaining a quiet tension that prevented complete stability and kept the possibility of renewed conflict alive. The later phase of the Wars of the Roses thus unfolded as a slow narrowing of options, in which exhaustion, adaptation, and the passage of time gradually reshaped priorities, setting the stage for a final resolution that would emerge not through sudden transformation, but through the cumulative weight of years spent living with uncertainty. Richard III emerged during the closing years of the Wars of the Roses as a figure shaped by long exposure to instability rather than sudden ambition, and his rise reflected the complex environment of loyalty, necessity, and circumstance that had defined the conflict for decades. Because by the time Richard moved toward the centre of power, England was already accustomed to change, and the presence of another ruler felt less shocking than it might have in earlier generations. Richard had spent much of his life within the structures of Yorkist rule, learning governance, military command, and administration through steady service rather than dramatic ascent. And this background gave him a reputation for competence and diligence, qualities that mattered deeply in a period marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. When Edward IV died, leaving a young heir, the familiar problem of minority rule returned, reviving anxieties about stability and reopening questions that England had struggled with repeatedly. And Richard's appointment as protector was framed as a practical response to this uncertainty rather than a calculated seizure of authority. The transition from protector to king unfolded through legal arguments, council decisions, and public declarations that emphasized order and legitimacy, reinforcing the sense that Richard's accession followed established processes even as it altered the line of succession. Contemporary reactions to Richard's rule were varied and often cautious rather than openly hostile, reflecting a society that had learned to withhold judgment until outcomes became clearer, and for many, the primary concern was not who ruled, but whether governance would be effective and predictable. Richard's reign was marked by efforts to strengthen royal authority, improve legal administration, and address grievances, initiatives that suggested a desire to stabilize the realm rather than prolong conflict. And these actions were often welcomed by those weary of uncertainty. Yet his position remained fragile, not because of immediate opposition, but because the legacy of the Wars of the Roses had made legitimacy itself a sensitive and contested concept, and alternative claims continued to exist even when not actively asserted. For ordinary people, Richard's kingship brought little immediate change to daily life, as local routines persisted and the rhythms of work and worship continued, reinforcing the separation between high politics and lived experience. The memory of past upheavals lingered, however, shaping perceptions and encouraging caution, as many waited to see whether Richard's rule would endure or give way to another transition. Richard III's brief reign thus unfolded within a landscape already conditioned by decades of adaptation, where authority was accepted provisionally and stability was valued above all else. And as his time on the throne progressed, it became increasingly clear that the long conflict was approaching a decisive moment, one shaped not by dramatic gesture, but by the accumulated weight of history and expectation. Henry Tudor entered the story of the Wars of the Roses quietly, almost at the edges of awareness, shaped by years spent outside the centre of English politics, and by a claim to the throne that, while distant, was carefully preserved and patiently sustained, and his emergence reflects the way the conflict often advanced through long preparation rather than sudden confrontation. Henry's lineage traced back to Edward III through the Beaufort line, a connection that was complicated and indirect, yet sufficient within the flexible logic of medieval inheritance to provide a foundation for legitimacy, especially in a political environment exhausted by uncertainty and open to new solutions. Much of Henry's early life was spent in exile, moving between regions beyond England's immediate reach, and during this time he learned the value of caution, restraint, and timing, qualities that would later shape his approach to power. Exile did not mean isolation, as Henry remained connected to English affairs through correspondence, supporters, and shared memory. And this distance allowed him to observe the unfolding conflict without being consumed by it, giving him perspective that those embedded within the struggle often lacked. As Richard III's reign progressed, Henry's claim began to attract renewed attention, not because it was overwhelmingly strong on its own, but because it offered an alternative unburdened by recent associations, appealing to those who desired closure rather than continued rivalry. Support for Henry grew gradually, built through promises of reconciliation, marriage alliances, and the prospect of ending the long cycle of instability, and this emphasis on unity resonated in a society increasingly weary of prolonged uncertainty. Henry's approach remained measured, avoiding dramatic declarations until circumstances aligned more clearly in his favour, and this patience reinforced the impression that his bid for the crown was calculated and deliberate rather than impulsive. For many nobles, the decision to support Henry was shaped less by enthusiasm than by pragmatism, reflecting a desire to secure peace and preserve estates in a shifting political landscape. Among the broader population, Henry Tudor remained a distant figure, known primarily through rumour and anticipation rather than direct experience, and daily life continued largely unchanged as his presence slowly entered political conversation. Henry's gradual emergence illustrates how the final phase of the Wars of the Roses was shaped by the search for resolution, as exhausted elites and communities alike looked toward figures who promised stability, setting the stage for the concluding events that would bring the long conflict to its end. The Battle of Bosworth Field marked the concluding moment of the Wars of the Roses, not as a sudden eruption of chaos, but as a carefully anticipated encounter shaped by years of uncertainty, negotiation, and quiet preparation. And for those involved, it represented less a dramatic climax than a final attempt to bring clarity to a conflict that had lingered unresolved for decades. When Henry Tudor landed in England, his movement inland unfolded deliberately, guided by an understanding of regional loyalties and the need to avoid unnecessary confrontation. And this measured advance reflected the broader tone of the period, in which leaders sought advantage through alignment and timing rather than overwhelming force. Richard III, aware of the challenge but operating within a political culture already conditioned by repeated transitions, gathered his forces with a sense of formality and restraint, preparing for battle in a manner that emphasized order and discipline rather than spectacle. The engagement itself was limited in duration and scope compared to later historical battles, shaped by the realities of medieval warfare and the desire of many participants to avoid excessive loss. And while the outcome proved decisive, the experience of the battle was contained, focused on key figures and moments rather than widespread destruction. The shifting of allegiances during the engagement reflected the broader patterns that had defined the wars, as decisions made in the moment were influenced by long-standing relationships, personal calculations, and the accumulated fatigue of years spent navigating instability. When Richard III fell and Henry Tudor emerged victorious, the change in kingship was immediate but not chaotic, because England had grown accustomed to transitions and possessed institutions capable of absorbing them, and proclamations, oaths, and ceremonies followed established forms that reassured both elites and common people alike. For many across the country, news of Bosworth arrived gradually, carried by messengers and travellers, and was received with a mixture of relief and cautious expectation rather than jubilation, reflecting a widespread desire for closure more than triumph. Bosworth Field thus became significant not because of its violence, but because of its finality, offering a resolution that earlier battles had failed to provide, and its meaning lay in the way it condensed decades of uncertainty into a single outcome that could be accepted and built upon. The battle did not erase the memory of the wars, but it created space for a new chapter, one in which authority could be consolidated and the long process of healing could begin, guided by the hope that the rhythms of ordinary life might finally proceed without the shadow of unresolved succession. In the aftermath of Bosworth Field, the work of ending the Wars of the Roses did not rest solely on victory in battle, but on the careful, deliberate construction of legitimacy and continuity, and it was within this quieter work that the Tudor Union took shape, offering England a symbolic and practical path towards stability after decades of uncertainty. Henry Tudor understood that authority needed to feel settled as well as earned, and one of his earliest and most significant decisions was to marry Elizabeth of York, a union that joined the rival houses whose claims had shaped the long conflict. And while the image of the red and white roses merging into a single symbol would later become a powerful shorthand for reconciliation, at the time the marriage functioned as a pragmatic solution, designed to neutralize lingering opposition by weaving competing bloodlines into a shared future. This marriage did not erase the past, nor did it instantly resolve every grievance, but it reframed them, allowing former rivals to redirect their loyalty toward a dynasty that embodied both sides of the struggle. And this reframing mattered deeply in a society that valued lineage and continuity, because it allowed acceptance without humiliation. Henry's approach to rule emphasized consolidation rather than celebration, focusing on restoring royal finances, re-establishing predictable governance, and reinforcing the authority of the crown through law and administration. And this steady, methodical style contrasted with the uncertainty that had characterized earlier decades, offering reassuring through consistency rather than spectacle. The Tudor court worked deliberately to reduce the power of overmighty nobles, not through sudden confrontation, but through careful oversight, legal mechanisms, and the gradual strengthening of central authority, measures that reflected lessons learned from the instability of the past. For many nobles, the new regime offered an opportunity to reset relationships, reaffirm loyalty, and move forward without revisiting old disputes. And this willingness to accept the Tudor settlement was shaped as much by exhaustion as by conviction, as the costs of continued rivalry had become clear. Among the broader population, the Tudor Union was experienced indirectly through a growing sense of calm and predictability as taxes stabilized, justice became more consistent, and the presence of armed conflict diminished, allowing communities to settle back into familiar rhythms. The symbolic power of the Union lay in its ability to transform a story of division into one of continuity, presenting the end of the wars not as the triumph of one side over another, but as the beginning of a shared chapter, and this narrative would be reinforced over time through ceremony, art, and memory. The Tudor Union thus marked not an abrupt ending, but a gentle turning, guiding England away from the long uncertainty of the Wars of the Roses and toward a period in which stability could be imagined, pursued, and gradually realized. In the years following the Tudor settlement, life in England did not transform overnight, but instead eased gradually into a quieter, predictable rhythm shaped by the absence of constant uncertainty rather than by dramatic change. And for many people, this return to steadiness was felt less as celebration and more as relief, a subtle loosening of tension that had been present for so long it had become almost unnoticeable. Governance under the early Tudors emphasized order, record-keeping, and consistency, and while these administrative shifts mattered greatly at the center of power, their effects filtered slowly into everyday life through clearer legal processes, more regular taxation, and a reduced presence of private armies moving through the countryside. Nobles adjusted to a political environment in which the crown exercised firmer control, learning to navigate authority through service and compliance rather than rivalry. And while some resented this change, many welcomed the predictability it brought, having grown weary of decades spent recalculating loyalties. Estates that had been damaged or neglected during periods of conflict were repaired and reorganized. Fields returned fully to cultivation, and trade routes regained reliability, reinforcing economic stability that allowed communities to plan beyond the next season. Memory of the wars lingered, but it softened over time, transforming from immediate concern into stories shared by older generations. Recollections that carried lessons rather than fear, and this shift in memory helped integrate the conflict into England's broader historical identity, rather than leaving it as an open wound. Churches, markets, and local councils resumed their familiar roles as anchors of daily life, and while political awareness remained, it no longer dominated conversation in the way it once had, allowing people to focus again on personal and communal matters. The reduction in armed conflict also altered social expectations. As younger generations grew up without the assumption that political instability was inevitable, and this change in outlook subtly reshaped priorities, emphasizing continuity over vigilance. The end of the Wars of the Roses thus did not usher in perfection, but it created space, room for recovery, reflection, and gradual rebuilding. And in this space, England rediscovered a sense of normalcy that had been missing for many years, not through grand gestures, but through the steady accumulation of ordinary, peaceful days. As time passed, and the immediate consequences of the Wars of the Roses faded. The conflict began to live on in a different form, shaped less by lived experience and more by memory, storytelling, and interpretation. And this transformation altered how the wars were understood by later generations, smoothing rough edges and simplifying complexities that had once felt immediate and unresolved. People who had lived through the wars remembered them unevenly, often recalling long stretches of ordinary life punctuated by moments of disruption, while those born afterward inherited a version of events filtered through family stories, local traditions, and the selective emphasis of chroniclers who sought to impose coherence on a long and complicated period. Written accounts played a growing role in shaping this memory, as monks, clerks, and later historians organized events into narratives that emphasized key figures, battles, and turning points, creating a sense of direction that had not always been apparent to contemporaries living through the uncertainty. Over time, the houses of Lancaster and York came to be represented symbolically through the red and white roses, a visual shorthand that simplified allegiance and identity, even though such symbols had held far less significance during the conflict itself, and this symbolic clarity made the story easier to tell and remember. Drama and literature further shaped perception, especially as later writers drew on the wars to explore themes of power, loyalty, and ambition, focusing on personalities and moments that lent themselves to storytelling while leaving quieter processes in the background. These retellings often emphasized sharp contrasts and decisive actions, transforming a prolonged negotiation of authority into a series of dramatic episodes. And while this approach captured attention, it also distanced audiences from the slow, patient reality of the period. Memory also softened judgment, allowing former enemies to be folded into a shared national past, where their conflicts could be viewed as part of a necessary journey towards stability rather than as failures or tragedies. For communities across England, the wars became reference points rather than immediate concerns, invoked to explain family histories, local changes, or broader lessons about governance and continuity. This evolution of memory demonstrates how history settles over time, losing some detail while gaining meaning, and by the time the Wars of the Roses were firmly established as a story rather than an experience, they had become less about who fought whom and more about how England endured, adapted, and ultimately found a way forward, carrying the lessons of uncertainty into a future shaped by reflection rather than conflict. When the Wars of the Roses are viewed from a long distance, stretching beyond individual reigns and battles, they appear less as a single dramatic episode and more as a slow movement within the broader flow of English history, shaped by continuity as much as by conflict. And this wider perspective helps explain why the period, despite its length, did not fracture the society that lived through it. The wars unfolded across generations, allowing change to be absorbed gradually rather than imposed suddenly. And this gradual pace meant that institutions, customs, and daily routines had time to adjust, preserving a sense of order even when leadership shifted. From this vantage point, the conflict can be seen as a prolonged negotiation over authority, legitimacy, and governance, conducted within established frameworks rather than outside them. And this distinction is important because it underscores how deeply rooted tradition remained, even during times of uncertainty. England's legal system, religious life, and local governance continued to function throughout the wars, providing stability that softened the impact of political upheaval and ensured that the foundations of society remained intact. The repetition of challenge and resolution, exile and return, loyalty, and realignment created a pattern that taught both rulers and subjects the value of patience, adaptation, and restraint. Lessons that would influence political culture long after the conflict ended. Over time, the memory of the wars became less about rivalry and more about endurance, illustrating how a society can navigate prolonged uncertainty without losing its coherence. This long view also reveals how the Wars of the Roses helped reshape the English monarchy, strengthening central authority and clarifying succession in ways that reduced the likelihood of similar conflicts in the future, not through sudden reform, but through accumulated experience. For those living in later generations, the wars served as a reminder that stability is often achieved through quiet persistence rather than dramatic change, and that history's most significant transformations frequently occur over extended periods of adjustment. As the centuries passed, the details of individual battles and personalities faded, while the broader lesson endured that even long struggles can settle into continuity, leaving behind a society shaped but not broken by the experience. And in this sense, the Wars of the Roses stand not only as a story of conflict, but as an example of how time itself can act as a stabilizing force, smoothing divisions and allowing life to move forward steadily and calmly into the future. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending this time here, letting this quiet history unfold at an unhurried pace. The Wars of the Roses were not only about crowns and claims, but about patience, adaptation, and the way ordinary life continues, even through long uncertainty. If you found this story calming or helpful as you listened, you're very welcome to subscribe to see new videos like this every week. For now, you can let the story rest and allow the night to continue on gently wherever you are.